VEDA Day 19. Today I'm going to talk about something completely different, and sort of two parts to this. The first part is a general statement about arguments on social media, and the second one is about the specific thing at issue here, which is gun laws and gun rights in America. So I'll start with the first thing, which is to say that, every once in a while I ignore my own self-imposed rule and put a comment on someone's post on Facebook that's politically tinged in nature. That almost uniformly turns out to be a bad idea. I think the overwhelming majority of adults don't believe what they believe because they've critically examined the evidence. They believe a certain way because either through upbringing, culture, experience, they've come to emotionally connect with a certain set of beliefs, and those sit uncritically examined, or they're examined only with a level of criticality that one can attain in the echo chamber of being surrounded by people who agree with you 100% of the time. And I think the unfortunate thing about that is that it leads to essentially people coming to the conclusion that it's not possible for people of good conscience or good faith to disagree with them on their viewpoint once they've come to it. Whether it's on the issue of religion or sex or government, or in this case, gun rights in America. So permit me to summarize the argument, basically, which is that in America, something like 30,000 people die every year because of a gunshot wound. Now, about 2/3 of those are self-inflicted. So 20,000 of the 30,000 people that die of gunshot wounds try to commit suicide, and that's why they died. The other 10,000, obviously, were people that didn't intend to kill themselves, so they intended to kill other people, and that's a bad thing. Putting that in context, though, it's not a specifically large number given the size of the population. For example, it's not bigger than deaths on the highway, as an example. Not trying to minimize that every death isn't a tragedy. I'm just trying to put the problem of deaths by gunshot wounds into the context of the problem of people dying untimely and unfortunate and tragic deaths, period. Okay, so I'll start with that. Fact number two, there's hundreds of millions of guns in America, and a good third of the population possesses one. Now, I know that may be really hard to believe for folks who live in dense urban cities or dense urban areas that have been governed, in some cases for decades, by a regime that makes it really difficult for people to obtain, or I should say for law-abiding citizens to obtain guns, and frankly to have the regular practice with them required to really sort of feel comfortable with their operation and not be scared of them. So, however, a large swath of the population doesn't live in such an area, and they're to make up for that side of things, there are large swaths of this country where the overwhelming majority of people own firearms, and in some cases multiple firearms. So there are plenty of places in this country where it is an exception, it is the anomaly for an adult not to own and be proficient with a firearm. And that may be a high-capacity firearm, that may be several firearms. And so when you think about that, when you think about 100 million people owning firearms and something like 10,000 people a year dying as a result of them, and in many cases, obviously, it's one person killing more than one person. So, the math at worst, if you think about it, is 10,000 divided by 100 million, which is 1/10,000th. And so that is 1/100th of 1%. So that's 99.99% at least of people who own guns don't commit any crimes with them. Or I should say don't kill anybody with them. Maybe that's a bit of a bridge too far. So that's sort of the state of the reality. Lately, it would seem that a lot of the incidents of gun violence have happened in places that already have very tight gun control regimes. Certainly, at the period of time in which Washington, D.C. had the tightest gun control in America, it was also the place in the country where you were most likely to be murdered. I do think there is a strong correlation between those two things, at least in this country. But this really gets back to the fundamental issue, and that is that where does sovereignty proceed from? In our country, it proceeds from the people. The words of the Constitution start with "we the people." In this theory of governance, the individual precedes the state. So first you have people, and then people get together and decide to delegate some of their inherent powers and rights as human beings to a collective organization, basically because they allow that organization to specialize in the defense of people's rights. It's a topic for another time whether the decision to so delegate has generally worked in favor for us. I'll leave that question for another time. But the right to own a gun is fundamentally about your sovereignty as a person. Because if you have any right, you have the right to protect yourself against death. And courts have ruled time and time again that the police have absolutely no obligation to help you. That if the police were to witness you being beat up by another person, being beat to death with a pipe, that they're legally not obligated to intervene. They have no obligation to do so. They might, and they might not. And their failure to do so, regardless of the circumstances, cannot hold either the state collectively or the individual police officers liable in any way. There is no obligation on their part to protect you, okay? Their obligation is to enforce the law as they see fit, period, and not to protect you. And since their obligation is not to protect you, then whose obligation is it to protect you? The answer is it's your obligation to protect you, okay? And I'm fine if people would rather die and would rather see their children die than have to shoulder the burden of potentially killing another person by becoming competent themselves with a piece of equipment called a gun that permits you to protect yourself. Okay, if your aversion to killing another human being is greater than your aversion to having you and your family die, that's a choice that you're allowed to make for yourself. But it's not a choice that you can make for other people. Other people would say no. If my family is being mortally threatened by another human being, that other human being is going to die rather than my family, and I'm going to take the steps and take the responsibility, the moral responsibility, for pulling the trigger. And every person that I've ever met who owns, maintains, and practices with a firearm understands that responsibility. And it's a serious one. If you decide to strap on a weapon and carry it in a concealed fashion, then you're taking personal responsibility for the outcomes of what happened there. And it's not for everybody. And frankly, I don't want to live in a society where there's not enough people that take that responsibility, because that ultimately is what keeps us safe. It's not the police. It's not anything else. It's the sure and certain knowledge that there's a decent fraction of the population out there who can defend themselves, that keeps the murderers from murdering more people, because they're sociopaths, they're psychopaths. And the idea that passing a law is going to stop psychopaths from doing what they're going to do. No, all it's going to do is prevent people who place obedience to the law as a high ideal. It's going to remove them from the pool of defenders of humanity. It's no different than Well, I would say every culture, every totalitarian regime, every authoritarian regime has begun with limiting this right. And I don't want to join that list of people. I want to join that list of countries. That would be a bad thing to have happen. So that's sort of my rant on that. Gun ownership ultimately begins and ends with protecting people from the violence of others, and that includes the violence of governments. And so in the future, rather than responding to people's Facebook passages about subjects like this, I think I'll just rant into the video, and then that will get my viewpoint out there, and we'll get it off my chest. And I guess that's it for today, so have a great day, and thanks for watching.